everybody. On Chapter 9, Identification, Assessment, and Evaluation. It'll be good now to get kind of into the meat of the special ed paperwork and such that you'll be working with now that we kind of have a basis of the laws that create all these things we need to do. Now we can really focus in on the day-to-day things that you're going to be doing as a special ed teacher. So let's begin. So assessment. In the text, they say that they're using, in IDEA, they use the words assessment and evaluation interchangeably. So whether I say assessment or evaluation, I mean the same thing. The process we're going through to identify kids that would be eligible for special education and to develop their program. So assessment and evaluation is kind of the key to, does that student have a disability? And if they do they require special education? And 3, what are the nature and extent of the student's academic and functional needs that need to be addressed in an individual plan, an IEP? We're going to visit this later as kind of that 3-prong test. And you'll see it when you look in that multidisciplinary document, the eligibility document, and we have to address these 3 things. So we're going to address, do they have that disability? Does that disability impact that education? And then how are we going to address that through special programming? So what does assessment do? It kind of answers for us the who, the what, the where, the how. So who should be receiving the special education? And that's going to look at those decisions that look at classification and eligibility for those services. The what is going to be what instructional services will we track? So these are our, when we're looking at planning a program for the student, writing that IEP, that's the what of assessment. The how. How will the student's progress be monitored? So that's taking that IEP and evaluating the decisions we've made in their program. Are they progressing? Do we need to make things move on to the next step? Do we need to go back a couple steps? So really monitoring that, the how. And then the where looks at the placement decisions we make. Where will that student get that special services, and where will it most effectively be delivered, that least restrictive environment? And we look at all of those things, the who, the what, the where, the how, from our assessment. And we're going to say, that if we can answer those and make good decisions through all of those questions, then that student should be given a FAPE. And so that assessment is just critically important piece of this process that, leads us to develop that whole program to make sure that they're getting that free, appropriate public education. If that assessment process is flawed in any of those areas, that could deny a student a FAPE, and that's where some districts can get in that legal trouble. So let's just quickly overview kind of that cycle of assessment before we go into each part. So typically you're going to start with that pre-referral process, and then from there, after trying some interventions, we might say, we maybe need to refer this student for special education. So you have that referral. And then if we do decide, we need to go on, then we go on to that evaluation phase where we're doing all the assessments and gathering all the data. From there, we come together and we make that determination if the student is eligible for special services or not. If they are eligible, then we go on to develop an IEP, their program. And as they progress through the year on that IEP, we're going to monitor their progress and report that to parents. We meet annually to revise that IEP. And then last step there is every 3 years we reevaluate to look at the student's needs. So that's kind of an overview. Now let's dig into each of those pieces. Pre-referral. Does your school have a formal process for that pre-referral? I find with the schools that I work with, some of them have really great pre-referral teams, and some of them really don't have anything in place. And I can tell you that I think it moves a lot, the process moves a lot more effectively when they do have that pre-referral piece in place. They're really making the right decisions on who should be evaluated and maybe who needs a little bit more intervention, maybe not that intense yet. So this can look a lot of different ways. You have those assistant team meetings, whether you call it the SAT team or the TAT. There's lots of different names out there. And or does your school, are they part of that multi-tiered systems of supports, the MTSS, or that what used to be called response to intervention? So all of these pieces do meet the district's requirements for child find, like within the school. So, we have some of those other things where we do the early childhood screenings and look out into the community for students suspected of a disability. But this would kind of be our watch within the school. So that's all covered by that pre-referral, gathering a lot of that data. Sometimes a parent will make a referral. So it doesn't necessarily require a district to complete the evaluation, but if they decide not to, then they need to be sure to explain their reasoning for not completing the evaluation using that prior written notice form. I would say that probably doesn't happen a whole lot. Usually you're just gonna, if a parent wants that, you're probably gonna go through with it unless you can explain the process and how you kind of start with the pre-referral intervention. On the next slide here, we have just, the classic triangle for MTSS and how that might look in a school. It can be two different things within the same triangle and how we deliver that intervention. So we can look at those academic interventions, and that's going to be that response to intervention piece, the RTI side of it. And then the side that says PBIS is positive behavior interventions and supports, and that looks at that behavior piece. So we can look at both things, which fits with special education really well, because we don't only look at that academic piece, we look at how those behaviors interact as well. So this is not special education, but this is the whole school. So looking at the bottom part, the biggest part of the triangle there is green. Within that green, that includes all students and how they are progressing on skills. So, the majority of your students are going to be okay. They're going to meet those standards at grade level. Well, within that group, you're going to have a few more students that maybe are struggling with the standards here and there, and they need some more support. So that yellow section are those that targeted level. So you might have a team that works to provide support and extra intervention to those students to help them get on that grade level or meet those standards. Then still within that yellow group, you're going to have a few that continue to struggle even with those middle level interventions. They need more intense help, and so they're in an even smaller group and receive even more intense intervention to help get those, math skills, reading skills, or working on behaviors. So then, kind of the thought is if students don't respond to interventions at that very intense level, then the thought is we would go on to a special education referral at that point, because they definitely need that specialized instruction to make progress. And we have to be careful with this. There's been some criticism when it comes to MTSS and special education referral, because they might not understand the process, or they don't want you to delay getting that evaluation or delay making that referral to go through this process. Because if we have a concern, then we need to, address that with an evaluation. But also, it's good to kind of give it some time too to work through this process without needing to be in special education. So South Dakota has several schools that have become PBIS schools or MTSS schools and have gotten a lot of support from at the state level with training and looking at data and those sorts of things. Due to that, they offer a lot of trainings around the state. And I just noticed in the Special Ed July newsletter that there are some PBIS, Preventing Behavior Escalation to Avoid Dangerous Situations. So that's coming up July 30th in Sioux Falls, August 3rd in Rapid City, August 10th in Aberdeen, and August 14th in Pierre. So I believe the Sioux Falls one was full. I think I was on a waiting list to go to that one and haven't heard any updates on that. So those, keep an eye out. There's always something related to this MTSS that the state offers as professional development. So that's kind of our pre-referral stage. And then there's some different, vocabulary here when we're looking at getting those kids to be identified. So we start with that screening, and that's kind of done with all students. So think of that green part of that triangle. All students might, in an elementary school, all students might go through that DIBELS reading assessment to see where their reading level is. So that would be a screening. Screenings are done to, all students for the purpose of developing those small groups, so we don't need parental consent to do a screening when it's something we're doing to all students. So then the next part would be, as we get more intense and moving up that triangle from, the yellow, so much those kind of interventions probably don't need a lot of parental consent. You probably would alert the parent that there was a concern and that you're going to intervene, but it's not under IDEA to get that parental consent. At that referral, please. This is where the teacher or the parents are going to, of the student, say they may be in need of special ed. So we're going to gather all that information and data to support that decision. At that point, then, when you decide, yes, we are going to evaluate for special education, that is the point where you need to get that parental consent, because we're looking at one individual student and looking at whether they qualify for special education. So that's where you need to get that parental consent. And so that leads us to that determination of eligibility, and that's where you're making that decision if they qualify or not. And this is kind of where those special education rules start to apply. So once we decide if they're eligible, and we look at their programming. So this was that first prong. They are a student with a disability. Now we need to look at the second piece. How does it affect them educationally? And how are we going to develop a specialized program for them to progress? So this, in a sense, is really what that assessment piece is used for. You really want to tailor your evaluation data so that you can write a really good program for the student. So in those programming decisions, you're going to plan for that individualized instruction, write goals, determine what services they need, and then how are you going to track that? How are you going to monitor their progress? So since that information, that assessment information, is used to create their whole program, it really needs to be accurate. You have to have a very good, well put together evaluation plan. Some school districts have been brought to court because they've not conducted a thorough enough evaluation, and therefore, one of those pieces is missing, and the student is proved to not be provided with a FAPE. All pieces of that evaluation are important. Often being at a school psychologist, the scores that I get from my testing are often those numbers that they need to make the student eligible. And often they think that's the only information we need. What was that IQ, and what were those achievement scores, and what score do we need to fall below? But really, that is just such a very small piece of developing the program. Because what I can get from my evaluation, I can tell you a lot of things, but what you get from that skills-based assessment and looking at all the pieces and all the other people that contribute to the team, that really is as the meat of developing the best program and knowing where the student is in relationship to their peers and how we can progress them forward. At what rate do we need to do that? So that skills-based assessment that you will be doing is so very important. It makes that IEP. And we think that evaluation, that's kind of that initial evaluation, that's the baseline from which we are going to see students progress and measure that progress. So if you remember, when we talked about FAPE, it was divided into two sections. We looked at procedural requirements and substantive requirements. When we're looking here at evaluation, we're going to look at the same thing. So we're going to look at those procedural requirements. And that's really going to deal with getting that parental consent, making sure they are a key part in this whole evaluation system. And making sure that they are consenting to the evaluation being done before anything is started. And then also we need to follow the correct timelines. We got to get that written consent, and as soon as we get that in the district, that initiates and starts our timeline. And this often gets confused. I remember really going over this with teachers a lot to really solidify in their mind what is that timeline. So, as soon as you get that consent, signed consent form returned to you at school, that initiates that 25 school days to conduct the evaluation. So it doesn't matter if you do that on day 2 or you're doing the eval on day 24 or 25. It just has to be within those 25 school days. And then, starting on that 26th day, you have 30 calendar days to hold your meeting of determining eligibility and developing an IEP. And we'll go more into that later. Now, let's see what this looks like when it comes to the paperwork that you'll be working with. Now, I took these forms off of the state website. That's what our schools use. I know Sioux Falls, a couple of you from Sioux Falls School District, and yours look a little bit different, but they should have all the information, same information, somewhere on the form. So let's first look at this parental prior written notice, the consent for evaluation. So you see at the top, it's just all that identifying information. And then we need to decide which type of evaluation are we doing. So when we go through that pre-referral, we decide, yep, we're going to refer this student for see if they're eligible. That would be that initial evaluation. So, check initial evaluation. If it's a student that's already been in special education and we're looking at that 3-year reevaluation, then you would check that part. And then we have, reevaluation requested by the parent, reevaluation requested by the school district. That's if it's outside of that 3-year time period. And then sometimes you have to add things to evaluations, and that's when you would have additional evaluation. Sometimes you're sitting at the determination meeting and you're like, oh, they really had some fine motor concerns. Yeah, we didn't really see as a need before, but all these signs are here, so maybe we should get an OT eval in addition to what we have done. So that would be an example of additional evaluation. Or you're sitting at a meeting and determining, maybe did a screening for autism, and yep, we decided we need to go and do the full autism evaluation. So we would check that as additional evaluation. Just a couple examples. But here, where I circled in red, documented parent input. This will prove in a legal document that the parents have been involved in the process. So before you even get consent, you have talked to this parent. Maybe parents are part of your TAT, your pre-referral process even, which is great. But just jot down some things that you've talked with them and concerns that they have, or hopes they have for their child, and put a little personal information. Just sometimes it's just like parent agrees with the school. Well, that doesn't give us a whole lot of information. It'd probably be good to show the work that you put in to get that parental input. So don't leave that part blank. I know a lot of schools kind of get dinged on that in their evaluation because they've missed that box. So pay attention to that box. Okay, further down the form, we have all those check boxes. And oh my goodness, now we're evaluating what ones do I check. Well, if you don't know already, there is a great document that I use all the time. The teachers I work with use it all the time. And I put it under Unit 4, and it's called the Quick Reference Guide. This sheet has each disability category, all the 13 categories, and it tells you exactly which areas you are required to check for if you're suspecting that disability area, and it also leaves it open to anything else that the team sees as a need. So we're going to go through an example on the next slide, but you can see all the different things we can test for. Don't forget there's this little box below the listed check marks, and that's where you're going to look at some things that probably aren't as common, but you can, if you're doing a sensory eval under OT, that's marked there. If you're doing any type of screening, like autism screening, or you are doing a functional behavior assessment, all those things, or anything else that's not listed above, you can jot down in that box. Then, if you go down to the bottom there, sometimes you use already existing data to make your determination of eligibility. For example, you might have a student that you're suspecting other health impaired because they have ADHD. Well, they already have that ADHD diagnosis that they got when they were 7 years old. So we don't need to do that again. So you can have the parent, give you a copy of the diagnosis, and that you would write that in down at the bottom when it was done, or what test they used, and the date it was given. So it could be medical records, could be a diagnosis, it could be previous testing, like especially when you're doing like an additional eval, like we talked about on the previous slide. So if you're going to add an OT eval, you're not going to redo the IQ and the achievement and the observation or behavior scales. You're not going to redo all that part. You're going to just pull all that information forward to determine if OT needs to be related service. So you're going to just list all those things down below because they've already been given. So things at the top are the things that need to be, they're on that quick reference guide, and they need to be completed in the current evaluation. The ones at the bottom, we are just going to pull forward. Always a good idea in your file too to pull that diagnosis up with the most current evaluation so you have all your information in one spot. All right, the next slide. Here is just a snapshot. So I have the two forms side by side. So the very top part is that consent form, the PPWN, parental prior written notice is what that stands for. And then down in the right bottom corner, I have the quick reference guide for specific learning disability. So you can see there the bulleted points are the things we need to check, and you can see how they are checked with a red X on the consent form. So we have ability, we have academic achievement, and observation. Those are the things we need if we are suspecting a specific learning disability. And then if the team decides there's any other areas of suspected disability, other evaluations to be given, such as adaptive behavior, speech, or language. It's always good to check with your related service people, like the speech therapist or the OT, PT, to make sure, excuse me, if those things need to be checked. And your SLP, is it just articulation? Is it just language? Is it both? Just check with them to know what you need to check as part of that evaluation. So sometimes you're probably suspecting more than one disability. So just, take a look at that quick reference guide. So say we're suspecting specific learning disability, but a possible cognitive disability. So in addition to ability, academic achievement, and observation, we're going to need to add adaptive behavior to that, and then any other things we suspect. So it's a great tool. Print it off, put it in a binder, and have it ready for when you get those referrals. All right, so what needs to be included in this evaluation? We need to, remember it's not just one piece, it's a multidisciplinary evaluation. And so we need to gather, relevant functional and developmental information. That will look like probably your ability testing, your adaptive behavior, those types of things. Number 2, we need that parental information about the student, so you need input from the parent. You're going to address that in that box, but also, gather some more information from the parent, what things look like at home. If we're looking at behavior, they're going to fill out those behavior rating scales, so that's going to give their input. Any way you can make them feel a part of the process as well. Number 3, information relating to allowing students to access and progress in general education. So this is going to include like your achievement, your academic achievement, your skill-based assessment, any information on the day-to-day things they can do. And number 4, classroom-based assessments and observations from teachers and related service providers. And so, that's going to really hone in on that skill-based assessment and watching them in that general classroom setting. So all of this information is going to help you make those determinations of, are they eligible? What kind of programming do they need? Where does that need to take place? See how important it is, how it all fits together? Okay, now we're back to that PPWN, and this is the bugger part of this form where you have to write the narrative piece. But if you go to the IEP Technical Assistance Guide, which you'll find a link on the resources page, this document should be your Bible. It really should. If you have questions about anything or how to word something, this is the place to go. So I put on the slide here to find examples. There are actually 10 different examples on how to fill out A, B, C, and D on this form. Every situation you could imagine. So it's great resources on pages 50 through 57. Go there, especially as you're starting out with this. It's great to have, that written example, and that it's going to have all the parts in it that you need. So, question A is pretty straightforward, pretty easy. An explanation of why the district proposed or refused to take action. So, why are you doing this evaluation? And that's where you use all that pre-referral information to justify your statement there. That would also be if the school, like the parent referred the student, but the school district does not want to complete an evaluation. Here you would explain why you are refusing that evaluation. Now, box B, I outlined in red and put do not leave this blank, because if you look at the top of the form in the fine print, you must address each section below. A lot of times this box just got skipped, or they just wrote, we did not reject anything. You have to reject something. And it takes a little practice to figure out what you're going to write here. So the question reads, description of other options that the IEP team considered and the reasons why those options were rejected. A pretty easy one is the team considered not evaluating the student for eligibility, but felt that the needs were great and the data showed that the student we had concerns for a disability. Something like that. Look at those examples, but you have to address that question. C, description of each evaluation procedure, assessment, record, or report the district used as a basis for the proposed or refused action. So this can include your pre-referral data, but it also includes all those things, all those boxes you checked. What are you going to do? You're going to do an ability test, an achievement test, you're going to observe in the classroom, you're going to gather skill-based information, so all that just listed in there. And then the last one is description of other factors that are relevant to district's proposal or refusal. And look at those examples, and it can give you ideas of what to put in that box, but make sure you put something in every box. The more information you can gather here, the better, and the clearer it is for parents to understand this big confusing process. All right, so then the last page, this is the most important page for you to look at. So this is where the parents either consent or do not consent to evaluation. So that box below the identifying information, so they're gonna check that they consent or they do not consent, and then you need to look at their signature, make sure they signed it, dated it. Sometimes they might leave the date off, but then it doesn't really matter when they sign it. What starts your timeline is when they bring it back to the school. So when the school receives it, that's the date that we need to be concerned about. So you'll see that second red oval there at the bottom. The date consent was received by the district. Make sure you put that in there. I know some have, one of those little rubber stampers, and as soon as they get it, they put that date on it. So keep track of that. That's very important. So now I can't remember if our co-op added these things to the form, or because I pulled this off of our co-op site, or if it's on the state form, but we like to have them calculate the 25 school days and the 30 calendar days, simply because we work with 9 different school districts and everybody has a different calendar. And it can get confusing with conferences and snow days and all that, but snow days do not count. So sometimes if you have a bunch of snow days, that gives you a little extra time because school was not in session. Below that, well, before I go below that, let's skip up to that box that I skipped. So here it is. I am willing to extend a 25 school day timeline for the completion of my students' evaluations to the following date. This you don't want to do for an initial referral because you're really being tracked for the state for that timeline on those initial evaluations. So unless there's a major circumstance, um, follow that timeline for initial evals. Sometimes a student might be hospitalized and it just makes it difficult to get it done, but you won't use that very often or shouldn't use that very often. Try to stick to those timelines. Okay, now back to that bottom box. You'll see we need to make sure that we're really making those attempts to contacting the parent. So you can document below the date their first contact was made. Did you do it by phone? Did you do it by letter? And then was there a response? So you need to make a reasonable effort to gain consent. And so, kind of our standard there is, about 3 times would be reasonable. And if it's a reevaluation, a 3-year reevaluation, and you have made those 3 attempts to contact the parent, you may evaluate without written consent. But for initial evaluations, that is not true. You must have the written consent before you can evaluate. So I think that's the end of our scary paperwork. But like I said, consult that IEP Technical Assistance Guide. That has great things in it, as well as that eligibility guide. But that quick reference guide will be good for you as far as knowing what to check on the forms. Okay, so those are all those procedural things. Are we getting the right dates? Are we checking the right boxes? Or did we tell who we needed to tell to be at this meeting and that? So those are all those procedural things. So the second piece are the substantive requirements. So let's look at the program and is the student getting a meaningful education? So we're looking in regards to that assessment, did they get a full and individualized assessment? We want to take an in-depth look at that student's needs. And we want to make sure that our assessment matches those referral concerns, the nature of the problem. You don't just test behavior for every student. It needs to be that there was a need, concern about behavior, then we test behavior. It's not just a blanket, we test this, this, and this for every student. Or another example might be a student on a specific learning disability. You're doing the 3-year evaluation. You don't just test every academic area every time. You need to look at what are the concerns and then test those concerns. Look at the characteristics of the student to choose your assessment methods and materials. So in my case, I might look at a student that English is their second language, and they score pretty low on the English proficiency tests. So I need to decide, do I give them the regular IQ test, or would it be more beneficial for them to have a nonverbal test? So that's a way where I would look at the characteristics of the student. Do we need an interpreter? Sign language interpreter? Do we need, it kind of gets touchy using a language interpreter, as that changes the reliability of the tests. But look at, each student and what they need and what is the proper tools to use or methods to use when testing them. Next, we have students' learning and behavior patterns. This is where I might consider, can this student handle testing all in one session, all in one day? I'm driving, as far as 75 miles to a school. Boy, I hope I can get it all done in one day, but there are students that, they just need those shorter times. So I'm going to split it into smaller testing sessions and go out more than once. Sometimes you need your paraprofessional to accompany the student to the testing situation. I know I appreciate this, especially if it's a student, maybe it's a student like with Down syndrome that has some behaviors and they're used to working with the paraprofessional and they know the right prompts to give them to comply with directions. And I also like that I can say now, do they usually know this or not demonstrating it for me? So, those are some things to think about there. And lastly, does our assessment match the parents' concerns as well as the ones the school has? Sometimes we get those consent forms back and the parent will cross out things or add things to the assessment. So you gotta be watch for that as well. So, are we addressing their concerns as well? Hopefully we're doing a nice job before we send the consent home to know what their concerns are so we can add them and they don't have to add them or take things off before they send it back. All right, so also looking at those substantive requirements, we need to make sure it's a team decision. It's not just one person or one test making the determination for this student. So we need to have knowledgeable people at the table with, do they have that expertise in that certain area that's being assessed? If we have speech and language concerns, do we have a speech language pathologist sitting at the table? And, if there's fine motor concerns, do we have an OT sitting at the table? And so forth. IDA requires the exercise of professional judgment when making eligibility and instructional planning decisions. So in a sense, that means we can't totally rely on a certain formula and, it's just not legal. We need to look at each individual student and make our best professional decisions from there. It's a team decision. And then we make that team decision from those 3 prongs that we talked about at the beginning. Does the student have a disability? Is it affecting their education? And do they require that specialized instruction? Okay, number 3, is there a link between the assessment and the intervention? So, and this is the primary area that districts lose in due process hearings when their IEPs are challenged. So really make sure this assessment is so important that we link that assessment to our IEP and the intervention we're going to use. So assessment should show areas of need and match that intervention to close that gap. So we want to move those needs to strengths throughout their IEP. We're going to really look at that present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, that PLAFS page, or however you pronounce that little acronym. But that's your first pages of your IEP where you're going to say where they are. These are the student's strengths. These are the needs in the area of reading. These are his strengths and needs in the area of math and so forth. And we get all that information from our assessment. It's not just pulling it from what we saw the day before. It's, really look at all that information. So these come together, develop an educational program to provide that meaningful benefit for the student. Last area is data collection. Remember, assessment is the baseline which we develop our program, and we should see progress as the year goes on from that baseline. How are we going to monitor that progress? And if we see that there's not progress, do we modify it? If we see there's a whole bunch of progress, are we modifying it? So like we talked in that Andrew case, really watch how that student's doing so we can make sure they're progressing along. And the last point under data collection is, a student's progress is the critical determinant of them receiving a FAPE. So very important how all these pieces fit together. So that's kind of that process. We kind of went through that whole cycle. And now we're to the point for reevaluation. So a student is already eligible for special education we need to see how their needs have changed over time. So IDEA requires that students are reevaluated every 3 years, unless a parent or the school district feel either evaluation is not needed or they need to do it sooner. So usually it's every 3 years. Um, Although parents have the right to request a reevaluation at any time, when we're looking at section 504, remember reevaluations are conducted before any significant change in placement. That is not the case or the rule under IDEA, so don't get those things confused. And then reevaluation is required when considering long-term suspension or expulsion. That's where you're going to be doing those functional behavior assessments and deciding a placement for them and how they will receive their services during that suspension. And then we have independent educational evaluations, IEE. So under IDEA in our text, it says an independent educational evaluation is an evaluation conducted by a qualified examiner who is not employed by the school district responsible for the education of the student in question. So parents do have the right and are allowed to request one IEE per evaluation conducted by the school. They can, however, request one at any time at their own expense. The first one, they're allowed at public expense. So upon request of an independent educational evaluation, the school district can, one, provide that IEE at public expense. They're often given a list of evaluators to choose from, or they can choose their own. Two, the school district can file a due process complaint to request a hearing to prove that their evaluation done at the school was appropriate. And if they win the case, the parents can request an IEE, but it would be at their expense because they already proved that the district one was appropriate. And this all needs to be done without delay. So as soon as you get that request, you need to start moving on it. You know what? If a parent brings in this independent evaluation, the school district isn't under an obligation to accept the results, but they really must consider them as part of that decision-making process. And really, if you're in this situation, document how you considered parts of that evaluation or did not. And always good to document. Always remember that. Documenting is good. So lastly, like we looked at with FAPE, what are the lessons we can learn from districts that have been through litigation and then also through legislative changes? So principle 1, ensure that administrators, special ed teachers, general ed teachers, and evaluation personnel understand the importance of the identification, assessment, evaluation process. Number 2, don't use a school-wide RTI program or pre-referral interventions to delay or deny special education evaluation. 3, involve a student's parents in the assessment process. 4, use a variety of assessment instruments to allow the team to determine eligibility. And 5, conduct relevant and meaningful assessments that will help the IEP team plan students' SPED programs. So this is a big piece, really the heart of creating those programs for students and really getting to know their needs.